How's it going, guys? Gelphase here, and today, finishing up just as much as I can, I'm going to be doing some talks about the new flood that is now coming into Halo Wars 2. And mainly the talk about is, we're going to be talking mainly about units, what type of flood units we might see, and possibly either tactics and quite possibly any reason why we might be able to make them playable and all that jazz. It's not going to be easy, and most likely that might get put onto a separate video just because there's a lot to talk about. Mainly we're going to be doing some covering on types of flood units that we've already seen before in the past Halo Wars 1, and maybe even a couple other extra units that were left out that might come back in, and especially maybe even some new units that might put a little bit more strategy stress on players, as sometimes maybe simple regular tactics of any kind could, well, at least with most players would use, but not going to work on these guys, per se. But without further ado, let's kick it off with the most simplest form, the infection form. Now, the infection form, not to get confused, sometimes they call them spores, but if anyone's played Halo Wars 1, they should know what the actual name is. Sometimes they just call them maybe a little spore, but there was another type of, I don't know, it might have been more like an ability than an actual enemy, but they were called spores, and you don't want to touch those bad boys because they would mess all your troops up in a matter of just seconds. So we're going to mainly talk about the infection form, that's right. That little crawling bugger that just swarms you by the numbers. Now, so far I've seen on Halo Wars 2, with the little sneak peek trailers and a little bit of the gameplay we got to see, there's not a whole lot of tweaking that probably needs to be done to this particular unit, as luckily they pretty much, kept the same thing going with the infection forms in Halo Wars 1, and that was that they didn't really have any special abilities other than they just simply came in large numbers, but they did have some unique traits that gave them advantage, a field advantage on the field, is they had the kind of same principles as with aircrafts, in which they could traverse pretty much anywhere on the map. Except it was a ground-based unit, and it made sense because it just infection forms could pretty much crawl anywhere, ceilings, ventilations, and it's kind of like the facehuggers off of Alien. Just you just don't want to find one of these in a tight spot. It's not good. As for any kind of abilities these things should have, as I don't think there is a whole lot, and unless you wanted to, keep as many alive as possible, but the only abilities I think this thing could probably be able to do is maybe bury itself, kind of like with the Zerg on StarCraft. It was just a extra side ability that isn't too effective, but sometimes if you want to do a little sneak attack with a large number of units, just bury them and hide them. At that point, you would require a detector unit to actually find them. And if they're not paying attention, they could completely pass in a whole army of flood infestors without realizing it, and you could create some gnarly ambushes just by having them buried or something. It'd be even really interesting if they could do that on literally any traversed landscape, but who knows. I'm sure 343 will make some sort of adjustments for that. And there is probably a little bit more I wouldn't mind seeing, is a little bit more animation done with the infection forms. In the first Halo Wars, we at least got to see them, yeah, but they just weren't as intimidating. They weren't launching themselves at enemy units or something. They just kind of went by them, and they actually slowly were losing their own health, almost in a way, to attempt to infect just regular ground-based units. I think a little bit more animation should be put on these guys. We want to actually be able to see them infect units. Just show the terror, and like, you know, just go wild if you can with it, because we've all seen like the actual legitimate ways of the infection on Halo 3 so far, and plenty of other maybe little Halo lore movies. That yeah, it's a really messy process, but you know, you got to put that in. You can't cut that out.
Get it off of me!
I'm sure that they can find a quick way to do it so that way it doesn't mess too much of the gameplay, but more work on the animation for the flood infection forms infecting units. Gotta put a little bit, at least a little bit more effort on them. Make them as just as intimidating as the face huggers of Vailian. Just like that's the threat and the danger. They're like really fast, agile little buggers that if managed to get on any of your troops would spell like disaster for almost your entire platoon. It's just like a constant threat you're gonna have to deal with once one of your guys maybe manages to get tagged by one of these things. So no doubt, as for like any other abilities or tactics, I think it's fine. I think they've gotten just about everything else that needs to be. The thing about the infection form is it's not so much of a special unit by itself, but there are definitely other units within the Flood rank that will be more interesting because their abilities will be more focused on reproducing infection forms. That's about it on infection forms as far as I know. If there's more things, I'll try to see if I can find them. But now we're going to be getting to the real meat of the talk. Flood combat forms. This is probably going to take probably almost 60% of this video almost, just because out of many of the Flood unit types, the combat forms, there's a lot of extra styles of gameplay and styles of how to fight foes with these particular type of units is very interesting. Most of them are going to be pretty much cannon fodder units for sure, because in many of the first-person shooter Halos, Floods were simply just like common units that straight up rushed you. Some of them might have weapons, most of the time they're melee units, that sort of thing. In Halo Wars 1, we definitely got to see a lot more variants of combat forms, and most of them still followed the same principles as certain units that we would expect to be pretty much just the basics of combat forms, like infected grunts, jackals and marines, and even brutes. Even the brutes didn't seem too special. Even in the Halo 3, they were simply just another common regular combat unit that actually was even easier to shoot. These particular units, I think, probably will nothing special, no special abilities I think need to be added on to them. Though I do think by the Flood by itself, with any type of Flood facilities that they decide to make, I feel as if it might be less likely that these Floods will be able to actually just produce these units all by themselves, because they're basically infected units. That might be a separate cap tree for those particular kind of units. Maybe a way to balance the issue of making sure the Flood aren't too super OP on this game. Maybe they can check up other principles, like, you know, certain units with the Zerg. You know, the Zerg on StarCraft used to have an infectious capability that was put on there, but unfortunately after numerous tests they had to take it out because they found out it was way too overpowering. It gave players a huge extra advantage that probably should not have been put in. Literally to the point where if they were going to make a unit like that, they had to create a completely different game mode in order to make it more balanced for other players if they decided to have players versus that. So I don't know, maybe the combat forms could have like a decaying moment where basically they're like slowly losing health and they would have to be in a particular area, maybe a flood infested area, to keep their health from draining or something. Maybe a way to kind of make it a little less overpowered, as the flood are obviously, unlike most other factions, kind of terraform the landscape while they're growing. So it's something to look on to. Or maybe some of the regular common cannon fodder combat forms could be like mini carriers. They could like maybe have an upgrade where they'd have like these large bulbous things that would just kind of form on their backs, and they're not true absolute carriers, but they have like at least a little bit of a deadly payload. I would kind of see it almost as like dangerous as kind of like with the suicide grunts in that manner. So like they are common cannon fodder soldiers that come at you, and maybe if their health is a little lower than usual, then they may actually try to just come at your guys and just straight up explode with a smaller payload. I'd say, like, because we'll get to the carriers in a moment, that the carriers probably would just one-shot an entire group if it got you there. So that's the kind of danger I would expect the carrier to be as. Way more threatening than even a suicide grunt, that's for sure. But no doubt, some of the more interesting units would probably be more along the lines of infected flamethrowers and elite units. These were the really interesting ones that I think could put a little bit more extra in the fight of dealing with the flood. We have seen the infected flamethrowers in the first one, and they just simply were an infected flamethrower, almost probably less dangerous than we expect them to be, because they simply just were slower, they didn't have as much range. And that was the idea with actual UNSC flamethrowers, is that they didn't have a whole lot of effect, other than like if they managed to get close enough to your troops, they would turn any of your ground units and even some of your fortresses. I think they were probably a bit of a fortress killer almost, that would do a lot of damage to those basic units. But other than that, they just didn't seem like a huge threat at the time. They might be able to change that, because you gotta imagine the fact that, at least when they made Blitz mode, flamethrower units had a little bit more of a threat to them, and that was like almost a completely different game mode, where now certain regular base units of infantry would have extra abilities. Like for instance, with the flamethrower, there would be wild flamethrowers, and if you managed to kill these guys, they would blow up. They would create an area effect where they would blow up, and anything caught in that area would straight up die, regardless of how tough they were. They might be able to try something with infected flamethrowers that might kind of make the flood just a little bit more dangerous when they're infecting units. It's something to think about. Now, of course, we're going to get to the real issue of any type of combat unit I've come across, even in a first-person shooter. All players probably can relate to the fact that the one thing you would not like to fight is infected elites. Infected elites are definitely probably one of the worst type of combat units that you would ever face. These guys were very fast for starters. They literally like had all the heavy traits and speed traits of some of the other floods. But what made them most dangerous is the fact that sometimes the tech that is on their body would still be operational even after the mutation. Like if you raised the difficulty in certain cases, sometimes these infected elites, their personal shields would actually still be operational, which means just getting a one shot off of them was a little bit more difficult, and it was even more dangerous if infected elites were carrying, say, an energy sword or some sort of melee based weapon. That was bad news. That was scary. That definitely would send any player just, no, I'm not doing that. Not getting close to that guy. If his shield is up, no thank you. And in certain rare cases, it never happened, unfortunately, in any other Halo game except for Halo 1. And that was that there was a certain area at the last level where, when you were on the Autumn, dealing with both Covenant and Flood and Sentinels, you managed to find like a secret area way in the back for players that like to venture just a little bit. And it was just a weapon cache. You'd get all kinds of cool stuff, rocket launchers, shotguns. It was a candy store basically. But I'm sure with every other player that went in there, sometimes when you went in there, obviously you go for the weapons and stuff, but then you notice a door would open and he didn't even see anything come out, and that definitely got players a little on edge, assuming like, oh, what's going on? And then you notice that some light was being vented, so now you definitely, for players that knew that, like, okay, cloaked elites or something. But then suddenly after dealing with them, you notice they are not elites at all. They are actually infected elites that still have operational cloaking on them. So that's pretty nuts. That freaked out a lot of players. So there's another little extra percentage. I think like if they were able to find a way to pass this onto Halo Wars 2, it would have to be some sort of like percentage odd upgrade, where like in like 1 out of 10 elites that get infected, some of those elites will actually still have operational personal shields or cloaking devices, and it would just make that particular kind of combat unit that the Flood infect maybe more valuable, be more useful. As with any other combat unit, they are mostly used as bullet sponges. They can take just a whole bunch of hits. It's literally like taking a regular infantry unit, say a Marine or an Elite or a Brute, and making their life and armor almost as strong as maybe a small vehicle like a Ghost or a Warthog, where they can take a lot more hits than just a regular common infantry should be able to. There's also another thing that could apply to combat units. Now we don't know if they'll decide to, like, you know, have reanimation abilities where like the bodies of the dead will still linger around the map. Very few RTS games ever did this, except for maybe I think Dawn of War. Didn't have much purpose in that, but it was just something to think about. There was another game that actually also kind of did that, and that was like Alien vs. Predator Extinction, which probably wasn't the best RTSs, but it was something to try out. That the idea was that if bodies got left around, they could possibly get infected, and they would rebuild their army piece by piece. So like, you know, after a gnarly battlefield has just been left alone for a long period of time, the infection type units, Flood, whatever, could go back to that area, sending their little infection forms to clean up the field. Or maybe they could, maybe 343 could try something maybe less hassle with that, because it'd probably take a lot of computer power to do that. They could try something like with Halo 1, though infected forms did not have the ability to infect corpses that time. They weren't thinking of that, but they did try something else a little more interesting that really freaked players out, and that was that sometimes combat forms that you killed in the first Halo Combat Evolved sometimes would not entirely die. Sometimes they'd get shot down and they'd fall down, and you would assume like, okay, they're done, let's go. But they would have, some of them would be on like a 5 or a 10-second cooldown, and they would suddenly just get right back up and start chasing at you. That's some Dead Space crap right there. Definitely the Necromorphs on Dead Space did that crap too, where sometimes you freaking shoot them in the head, or you shoot them so much that they just fall down, and then for some reason, without double tapping on them and not paying attention, they could just get right back up and just come at you without you knowing. A lot of players could make that mistake, and until you play the game enough to now learn like double tap is clearly necessary for these type of units, because you don't know if they're actually done in yet. So maybe there's a percentage system that can do that too, where maybe 50 or 60% of the combat forms that drop may suddenly just get right back up. In Dawn of War Dark Crusade, the Necrons on there had something kind of like that. It was an upgrade where now certain units, even if they get killed, they have a 50 or 40% chance that they suddenly would just reactivate and turn back on. Or there was a special ability that your leader could use that could literally repurpose all the units around them and just bring them right back to the battlefield. There were also certain types of recycling units that could clean up the battlefield to save resources. Because again, unlike the UNSC and the Banished, we don't know how the resource system of the Flood is going to actually work. How did they get the resources and all? But that's going to be different because those aren't even units yet. We're not going to be talking about that yet. But at least most of the talks about the combat forms have been finished. So now moving on to the carrier forms. Now obviously with carrier forms we've all seen them, and pretty much in the scientific lore of what the carrier forms are is they're basically combat forms that have like exceeded their purpose almost. Like they're either no longer useful as combat forms or they've taken on so much damage that they literally just turn into carrier forms and stuff. It's definitely a nice repurpose recycling method to save resources. It made sense. And basically what the carrier is what it is. Carries a bunch of little infection forms and is like a crawling IED. Very slow crawling IED, but you definitely did not want to have one of these units just blowing up in the middle of, well, infantry especially, and probably did a decent number of damage even on vehicles. So it was something to kind of try to avoid. Interesting how they will repurpose this, or how carriers would be actually produced. Because no doubt, in the first Halo Wars, there was no particular pickings of how units were produced. They simply just came out randomly out of these flood hives or these flood nests, flood dens, colonies. They had a decent number of facilities, but those all randomly spawned. And they clearly had no unit cap because of how many units were on there. So what kind of tweaks could the flood carrier put on? Well, that's a tough call, but maybe not too tough, because there might be something there, because you want these floods to be pretty effective, and hence the name carrier. Maybe there's a way to actually put that name in more useful, because it is a carrier. So what if maybe it behaves like an APC or a type of vehicle that can be garrisoned or something? Almost, it's not a vehicle; it is a unit. Maybe like if you kept filling up with infection forms, it would be bigger, or it'd have a bigger blast radius or something. So that's always something worth checking out. A bigger boom saw, or maybe an upgrade to enhance its speed. It's kind of like in a way, if carriers are basically damaged combat forms, it's almost kind of like the same unit, the Baylings from StarCraft. They basically are Zerglings, but if you get the Bayling upgrade, you can turn them into basically these quick bomber units that just blow up and do massive amounts of damage. Easy to repurpose, easy to make, and there's even an upgrade where they start rolling, and so they can move even much faster, and that made them even more dangerous. So it was easier to repurpose, easy to recycle. So definitely, a lot of what the Flood are doing are probably going to be taking a lot of cues from the Zerg and StarCraft. There's going to be a lot of obvious tactics that are going to be used on here. Alright, now moving on to the Thrasher form. Now, not to be mistaken for the pure form, because these are actually very different units, unfortunately. And we will get back to them in a sec, because I think the other one's probably a little bit more interesting than this one. The Thrasher don't know if there's a whole lot of tweaks in here that need to be done if they decide to bring it back, as it is basically their battering ram. This is their heavy class unit. In fact, it's a lot like the Goliath unit, the Hunter Goliath that was put on DLC for Halo Wars 2, the Colony. I bet these guys are, if they do put on here, these guys are going to be very much the same kind of units almost. And there's not a whole lot that I think needs to be tweaked around here. I think it's just a basic tanker form that uses melee ability, probably easy to produce possibly as well, and definitely deals damage to probably facilities and vehicles mostly. I think that's probably what his purpose was. As for any other extra add-ons, unless the Abomination is what replaced it, but I doubt that, because the Abomination looks definitely more like a leader class unit with probably some other special abilities that we'll try to go into after we manage to get to them. Other than that, the Thrasher, just your basic kind of onslaught frontal assault unit, pretty much takes all the bullet fire. In a way, a lot like the combat forms in this form, they probably are best used to kind of distract enemy units, allowing the infection forms to get up from behind them or try a pincer move on them, keep them distracted long enough, because the moment those infection forms manage to get to any of your platoons, it's bad news bears right there. Say goodbye to what's left of your units. Moving on, now some of the air units that the Flood used. We're going to start off with the Flood Swarmer. Flood Swarmer was an interesting unit that I did not expect to see. It didn't even look like any type of Flood unit. It literally looked just like some kind of weird, funky, mutated bat or something. But a unit nonetheless that was used by the Flood, and you know, yeah, they could use some air units. We never got to see any type of air units of the Flood except for these, except for two anyway. The Flood Swarmer, pretty much like a basic unit, probably like mini wasps or mini banshees almost, and they shoot like these little bony projectiles or something that just did damage or something. Didn't really do a whole lot. If there are any special abilities that these units could have, well, I don't know if infecting air vehicles would be one, because I think there's a special kind of unit for that. Otherwise, there was one moment where in Halo Wars 2, while you were dealing with the Flood and trying to escape, a Pelican was trying to deal with some Flood Swarmers, and the Flood Swarmers started attacking the Pelican and went as far as almost basically kamikazing at the Pelican. They just started running into it, doing probably even more massive damage than basically the regular projectiles that they spat out. So maybe that's a possibility of ability where they basically just start ramming into air vehicles. And who knows, maybe there could be a deadly surprise, because the focus of these units is to infect units. Maybe like they get lucky and they manage to break the glass in the cockpit. And what would happen if one of these things managed to get inside the cockpit of one of these vehicles? What would happen? Especially that the pilot can't pay attention to that a whole lot when they're still driving. Could they infect the vehicle? Who knows?
Break formation, engage all hostiles.
Having said that, we haven't really seen the Flood infect vehicles yet, but we'll talk more about that after like specialized units. Other than that, the Flood Swarmer seems pretty much of a basic air unit. Moving on to one of the most interesting air units that I think probably could use more tweaking, the Flood Bomber form. Now, we never got to see a whole lot of action on this unit. It didn't really actually have any abilities of attack whatsoever, so it wasn't that really impressive. But it was kind of like the UNSC Elephant. Basically, what it kind of did is it set up in an area and it just started spewing out Flood eggs. It kept popping. It was literally like a flood infester facility. It just kept spawning them over and over. It was like automatic. Like, probably in the control style of how it would work is a lot like an elephant, or maybe like those overlords from StarCraft that, like, once you set them in an area, they just start producing creep or something. It's automatic. It just keeps going and going and going, so you can just leave it there doing its thing while you're going worrying about other stuff. I think the bomber form is kind of like that, though. Does it need any special abilities or tweaks? Probably. I just don't know exactly what would apply to this particular unit, because it would have to maybe switch things up if it's dealing with maybe other air units that are attacking it. Does it have any defenses against that? Would it be like a floating bomb that would literally just explode, taking out many units? Or possibly maybe it has an infectious ability where it has to sacrifice itself in order to take control of maybe some type of air vehicle, so-called. It's a possibility. Again, I'll try to figure out if there's any more tweaks to this particular unit. Otherwise, we'd have to leave it to more new type of units. Now, moving on to at least one of the final units that we have seen in Halo Wars 2 was the Abomination. Definitely a leader class unit for sure, and it looks a lot like the deleted unit that was put on Halo 2. It was there, but they kind of took it out at the final time, I guess, just that, like, you know, like, nah, we don't need that. It would be too silly or too quirky to look at. But I guess now we are putting it on there. Interesting that it's taking a humanoid shape, walking on 2 feet and all. What would make this unit so dangerous? Because it's obviously maybe kind of a leader class unit, almost. And definitely majorly a melee attacker for sure. This thing basically just swipes its tentacles, probably does massive amounts of damage. It's kind of like probably like the Decimus unit, which is like one type of leader class unit that does like an area effect damage every time it attacks. It does some sort of massive amounts of attacks that just really hurt most of the units around it. But other than that, we didn't actually get to see a whole lot of special abilities from this thing. But I'm feeling as if there could be, just because of like the way the creature was designed. A lot of what the notorious things about the Flood units is that even any type of unit that dies will leave some sort of surprise. Flood infection forms will just pop or something. Maybe sometimes there's a percentage chance that they might spew out a spore cloud or something, which could infect your units, which is something you don't want to have happen. Flood carriers also explode. Bombers probably also explode, leaving units. Hell, even the combat forms sometimes explode, just leaving little infester forms for you to deal with. So what could be applied to this thing? Since, like, literally looking at it, it's got all these big boils and pustule balls all over its body. I feel as if, like, if this unit dies, it's gonna create a big explosion or something that will not only do damage, but the possibility of it spewing either a whole bunch of infectious forms or spewing a huge array of spores. Spore clouds that are just going to be rummaging all around the map. And those were, I'd say that's almost probably more dangerous and creates even more chaos than just regular infection forms, depending on like how lethal the infection forms are and how lethal they can make them. But you know, it looks like it would probably do something like that, just because like some of the one of the leader classes, I believe Kasanso, I think is what it's called. It's the flamethrower leader unit of the UNSC. She's a tough sucker, mainly kind of focuses on close range fire and stuff. But an interesting leader class that even if you manage to kill her, she's still dangerous, is that she's just packed with a bunch of flammable explosives. And just like the wild flamethrowers or any type of suicide-based unit, she blows up, she creates a little area effect of where she's going to be blowing up, and any units that are in it will die immediately. So I feel as if that the Abomination is probably going to be doing something like that even when it's dead. Something to look forward to. We didn't get to see a whole lot of what he does other than just swiping around, but I'm pretty sure 343 is going to be able to make him do more stuff. And I can't wait to see what the surprise is on that. But other than that, I'd say that's unfortunately the end of as much information as I could be able to give, as this video has already gone on probably more than half an hour now, so I think I've talked enough. Hopefully I'll be able to make a little bit more videos of any more extra information, but however, this video has gone up a little late, and I believe, if not by now, that 343 has probably shown some extra information on the new Flood campaign as we are increasingly heading towards fall. So hopefully this information will be at least somewhat helpful to them, whatever the case may be. And I guess I'll catch you in the next video. More information comes up. See you guys.